Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This program is titled World Watchers. It's program number 694, March 25th, 1985. Last week I concluded the broadcast with an article from the San Diego Union on the meeting of the World Anti-Communist League in San Diego in 1984, in September 84. The date is very important of the meeting because Major General John Singlaub was elected the president of the World Anti-Communist League at that meeting, and by December he was in the Pentagon working with the Defense Department with retired General Lansdale from Vietnam and Mr. Aderholt, another general from Vietnam. They had worked together in their operation group, and I'll be doing more on the connection of these two later. But the general who became the president of this group of Nazis, anti-Semites, racists, and death squads, particularly Central and South America, an American major general heads the organization, and American representatives were at that meeting. This particular account describes the attendance. There were 98 different countries, and the article says that the United States delegates emphasized non-military solutions, but the international members advocated all types of intervention. So that must mean that it was 97-1, but the fact is that the one who's against the non-military solutions is funding a bulk of the money and the psychological support and the strategy and training for the death squads in every way we have participated in those in South and Central America. So we put it in the hands of the groups like the Knights of Malta that work with the military and the medical relief group that I'll be going into this week or in the next couple of weeks, and we act like we don't want military intervention while we sit with Nazis and Death Squad, and we bring the Nazis to this country and supply the teaching. The schools used to be in Panama, now they're moved back to Washington, and our special forces, the Green Beret, go down and teach torture, and Nazis teach torture and interrogations. So while the meeting is attended by American representatives, and another article I'll quote has some of them, this one mentions Ronald Reagan's advisor and Georgetown University professor Ray Cline. Ray Cline was a high official in the Central Intelligence Agency, and I don't believe he ever left that role. He's said on national television that his acquaintanceship with Reinhard Gehlen, I suppose while Gehlen was in the CIA, helping form the CIA before he went to Germany to take over the BND, his own intelligence apparatus, which is exactly what he was doing with Adolf Hitler, or for Hitler, before the war was over. The expressed goal of this meeting, according to this account, was to provide information and liaison necessary to counter worldwide campaign of subversion and disinformation and news manipulation that fuels communist drive towards world domination. Well, I don't think they will ever learn that disinformation and news manipulation is going to drive anybody to communism. They refuse to admit that if people are hungry, they will form another form of government, or that Russia under the Tsar had extreme cruelty, and under the army of the Tsar, so that the people couldn't stand it and were forced to organize and overthrow them. John Singlaub mentioned at the conference that the colonial era, in that area, the living conditions were far superior to those in modern revolutionary nations. Well, the colonial era is what William Donovan and William Stevenson of the OSS and British intelligence were putting together. The way the British had treated the colonial nations that they controlled is what they were teaching the Americans, Allen Dulles and William Donovan, to apply to the countries that we would take care of when the war was over. Then John Singlaub, who was the main speaker and became the president of the group, said the message is correct. You can quote me, the message that anti-communist nations around the world have to spread. We don't want any more communist nations. These 97 people, we're talking about some very poor nations with not much standing. Singlaub and other delegates emphasized that the world cannot rest until all Soviet and Chinese governments are overthrown. I ended the program last week with that quotation and purposely repeated it, because what they're saying is we're going to have war against the Soviet Union, and I can just cut out my articles on the weapons contracts and the space arrangements and the Star Wars and the laser beams and the attack weapons that are going to be made, and the intent, such as Secretary John Lehman of the Navy talking about when we go to Russia, using those expressions on Nightline, that the war will take place and Congress will not have any say or vote. As long as we elect representatives who give them every weapon they want, and these representatives said they can't come home and face the constituents unless they give them the money for Star Wars and World War III, then it's really in our hands, because we could say to those people, we want anti-war candidates, and that isn't very popular. This group, the World Anti-Communist League, have stated, and they did again at their meeting, in quotes, living conditions in the world are not responsible for international terrorism. The Soviets are. And I don't agree with that statement, and you can take it for whatever it's worth. Now, another article on the World Anti-Communist League meeting in San Diego was written by Mark Allen, called World Fascists Meet, was greeted by Reagan. This is from the People's World, November 27, 1984. He says it was an international meeting that went almost unnoticed in the media, but not by the Reagan administration. The delegates to the World Anti-Communist League were in San Diego. It is a meeting of the world's most dangerous and well-organized fascists, every Nazi, racist, anti-Semite, terrorists of every ilk, those who long for the lost days of Mussolini and Franco, and those committed to the rule of Stroessner and Pinochet. They were represented by the United States, and I mentioned this in the other article, by Ray Cline, advisor and former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And of course, these former CIA are like former Nazis. I don't think that you can say that they aren't a part of that, just as James McCord again and E. Howard Hunt were on the payroll of the CIA at the time of Watergate. How can you separate a former? Because Ray Cline and John Singlaub and these various characters down at this meeting go back to Washington, to the Defense Department, and to the Central Intelligence Agency, and link and work with the Knights of Malta who are working with the Central Intelligence Agency. So he's not exactly a professor. He's still into the intelligence operation. And this article says among those present was Adolfo Calero, head of the Nicaraguan Democratic Front, the CIA-backed group of Somoza's National Guard of mercenaries and bandits. Also present were representatives of the Pol Pot-led anti-government coalition from Campuchia and former agents of South Vietnamese dictatorship Nguyen, I can't pronounce it, Nguyen Van Thu, I've always just called him Thu, and Mr. Premier Key, former Premier Key from South Vietnam. The South African-backed bandits were there fighting against the governments of Angola and Mozambique, and members of the resistance group from Afghanistan were there. The counter-revolutionary Cuban terrorist organization known as Alpha 66 was well represented, as well as the Italian social movement, the MSI, which is the heir to Mussolini's fascist party. Now, the Alpha 66 is and was formed by the Central Intelligence Agency, and Reverend Moon, who helped form the World Anti-Communist League, has members of the Alpha 66 writing for his Spanish newspaper in Los Angeles. He owns the Washington Times, and he keeps a paper for the Spanish-speaking people in Los Angeles and uses members of Alpha 66. The article goes on, the head of the World Anti-Communist League's Latin American branch, and one of their most beloved spokesmen is Mario Sandoval Alarcon, founder of the Guatemalan National Liberation Movement, the MLN, which he calls the Party of Organized Violence. It is the White Hand Death Squad of Guatemala. He's the mentor of Salvador's Death Squad leader, Roberto Donovan. And again, Donovan goes back to close alliances with Jesse Helms, Senator Jesse Helms, who wants to take over CBS. And I don't have to repeat that all the time, but he's a big factor in this group, the World Anti-Communist League, and John Singlaub, because of their relationships to the Defense Department, to Congress, to the religious right, to the far right-wing movement, and the people now who actually hold the hunk of money that controls where these private armies go. The article, General John Singlaub is not only the president now of the World Anti-Communist League, but he's chairman of the U.S. Council for World Freedom, which is an affiliate of the Anti-Communist League, and he's a leading member of the American Security Council. And I'll be doing a lot more on this at the end of this program or into the next few weeks. He has his tentacles into the World Anti-Communist League, the U.S. Council for World Freedom, the American Security Council, which is a violently anti-communist branch of the United States military and business together, similar to the way that the World Commerce Corporation started an offshoot of it. This is the group that he is also a leading member of. It consists of former generals and intelligence agents and corporate bosses, and the American Security Council was formed in 1955. It started in Chicago as a mid-American research library with computers and data on people to inform the government about screening for jobs in Defense Department, and they allegedly have 1,500 different firms for screening and 6 million file cards on various people. It was in the Torbett document describes under Permindex an operation, an umbrella for the assassination committees called DISC, Defense Industry Security Command. And they explained, the two authors of that document, and one worked for the CIA, that the purpose of that was to screen people working for weapon systems and missile stations and atomic bombs to make sure that they passed a security clearance. And a lot of people have said that that particular document couldn't be true because they couldn't locate that agency. But they may have been referring to something exactly like the organization that has these computers for people to get employment in the United States, known as the American Security Council, with more than 1 million people to clear. That was way back in the 60s. And the Defense Industry Security Command may be a branch of a private organization because the government and the Defense Department work through this for clearances and call there. And it may not be an actual part of the government because then it would appear that the government was blacklisting, but you can go into a private organization and get information. I had this article titled World Fascist Meeting Greeted by Reagan, continues on the origin of the World Anti-Communist League because, as I said, it was formed in 1966, but preceding it, in 1954, was the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, and it was mobilized by Chiang Kai-shek and his KMT party, the Kuomintang party, and they provided the founders of the World Anti-Communist League with the president, the honorary president for life, and he was seen recently photographed with Ronald Reagan in their current publication. After the Asian People's Anti-Communist League and the World Communist Anti-Communist League was formed based on the Asian People's Group, they didn't begin in Taiwan, where the other originated. They kept the one in Taiwan, and this was formed in South Korea, in Seoul, South Korea. And the main offices in South Korea at the Seoul Freedom Center were organized by Reverend Sung Myung Moon of the Unification Church. And I've done broadcasts on his relationship to Mr. Ryosha Sasakawa and Mussolini and the Brown Shirts and the Mussolini Party that is a part of the membership of the World Anti-Communist League. The funds for the Freedom Center, Reverend Moon, came partly from the South Korean dictatorship. The Korean CIA is identical to the CIA. There is hardly a bit of difference. And other money came from Ronald Reagan's closest allies, even though in 1966 he wasn't in the White House. He just became governor in California and had a close link to all these organizations, very tight link. They put him into office, and the relationship had continued from the time his political career started. But the money came from people who are now his closest allies. Each of them worked their way up into the White House and into prominence. And the main manipulator for the funds from the Freedom League that went to Reverend Moon, along with the money from Taiwan and South Korea, came through the help of Mr. Richard Vagary, who paid $908,000 for helping Reverend Moon and the Korean Cultural Center and Freedom Foundation to raise money. He was a fundraiser. Now, Richard Vagary was a big shot who took over the Young Americans for Freedom and began his work there, and has done the mailing list for Jesse Helms and the YAF. And remember the origin of YAF, of William Buckley of the Central Intelligence Agency, and General Walker, who was in Munich, Germany, and brought fellows from Munich to Dallas at the time of the assassination. and then they were to take over the YAF, and Vegary worked his way up to the very highest levels, and now he's running for office in Virginia, and he's on television quite frequently. The first president of the United States World Anti-Communist League affiliate was Lee Edwards, former editor of Richard Vegary's Conservative Digest. And I might remind you that when I did a few programs on Reverend Moon and Koreagate, that in addition to Richard Vegary working for them, Sven Kramer's name mentioned in those documents, congressional hearings. Sven Kramer is the son of Fritz Kramer, the man who doesn't appear at all in public, the German with the monocle, and he is the political mentor and military mentor of Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig and a lot of other these people that I'm mentioning. He had a big part in the Southeast Asian War as a plans officer at the Pentagon, and was the superior over General Westmoreland, who ties in with these people from the World Anti-Communist League. There is a very incestuous relationship here between our Defense Department, our CIA, the death squads, the real Nazis, not the neos. I keep clarifying that, and the relationship to people like Jesse Helms, who weave in and out with this particular organization. He's a member of it, and the intent, as I say, to take over one particular station that did embarrass General Westmoreland, who's close to these people. Now, some friends of Ronald Reagan's who are members of the World Anti-Communist League include Senator Jesse Helms, Senator Strom Thurmond, Jake Garn of Utah. Garn is on a committee that decides the money for Star Wars and space stations, particularly the space stations, because there have been allegations in that book, Alternative 3, about the plans for genocide and extermination, using those as one-way stations to get rid of massive numbers of population. And if you see what these particular people are doing on planet Earth, would you trust yourself going into a space ride where they give you a one-way ticket? It would be a little bit scary. Two other supporters of the World Anti-Communist League are Fred and Phyllis Schlafly. They are on the board of Technicolor with Patrick Frawley, the man who decided and started Ronald Reagan's career. Lev Dobryansky, a co-founder of the World Anti-Communist League. Also, Fred and Phyllis Schlafly began funding Pat Robertson and the Christian Broadcasting. Very close to him, J. Peter Grace helped Pat Robertson too, and Mr. Fred Schlafly was chairman of the American Bar Association Special Committee during the Joseph McCarthy hearings. They were close to Joseph McCarthy. And getting back to Dobryansky, he's a member of that National Security Council. He's on the board of Young Americans for Freedom. He's on the board of American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc Nations, and he's the author of a book, Captive Nations Week Resolution, that was passed by, not a book, it was a resolution passed by Congress. Now, this pretty well describes that meeting, and I'll go on to other articles, but there are quite a few Americans there. Oh, yeah, a member of the World Anti-Communist League. Another one is Marvin Liebman, a friend of Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond, co-founder of the American Jewish League Against Communism, the Committee for Monroe Doctrine, Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, part of the American Chilean Council in 1975, and with three others, the charter member of the World Anti-Communist League to win support for Vietnam, the former agents of Mr. Thieu and Mr. Key. He is very close to them, Martin Liebman. So another member of this group, American Estefany Pisonoi, you may have read his name in various articles, a member of the National Security Council, member of the American Security Council, the American Chilean Council, and he's connected with Lyndon LaRouche in the fusion industry and pushing that as fusion weapons and energy as a thing of the future. So I think you get a pretty good idea of John Singlaub's co-partners and buddies. Just to get the tone of John Singlaub, I wanted to go into the background of just the reporting of a particular meeting in San Diego where the writers selected a few little items for your education and interest. Now, there's two articles that were published in the Washington Post that I wanted to give more time to. I brushed through them too quickly because time ran out, and I want to put them in a order of succession and not pass them up as I build up to some other information pertinent to all of these people. The one that I'm referring to is titled Private Groups Press Contra Aid, Millions Raised in the United States. This is Washington Post, December the 10th, 1984. And on broadcast number 681, December 21st, 1984, I briefly mentioned this article, but left out a lot of names and the importance of the group that were meeting in Washington, D.C., because the common denominator here, again, is John Singlaub, who leaves his buddies in San Diego from the World Anti-Communist League, that motley crowd that I just have been listing some of the names and members and who attended the meeting. And after that was over, that was in September of 1984, by December, John Singlaub is in Washington with the highest echelons of the government. So that what the World Anti-Communist League really is the worldwide Odessa network working with our government. And as I said last week, that this fellow that worked in Hitler's youth was asked the question, remember, is there a chance of fascism coming in the United States? And he said no, because the government is different, separated, and the people have freedom of speech. But in Germany, the government was fascist. But John Singlaub and various people that were cited in this article and will be in other material I mentioned are the government. And that's the point I want to keep reiterating, that they're not private. The title is called Private Groups Press Contra Aid, but they're not private. They are Defense Department and they are Intelligence Department, and they are made to appear as private, which is part of that early setup of the OSS and the CIA of covert action, of doing what they want, but under the cover that these are private people doing what they want to do with their time and money, but actually planning strategy along with the Defense Department. And the reason the strategy is in the open and published with the papers like the Washington Post or other papers is I don't think they care anymore. They have what they want in Reagan. Their goal was to get Nixon and Reagan into power, and we become helpless so they can report meetings and have it above board, because what can you do about it? Now, this article describes, in quotes, a network of conservative activists and former military and intelligence officials, including several members of a Pentagon advisory panel on Central America, have stepped up efforts to funnel private humanitarian aid to Nicaragua rebels. If they're conservative activists and assume they're retired military and retired intelligence, they're sitting with the current Pentagon, so what's the difference? If John Singlaub works with Nazis from Taiwan or Chile or down in South America or Central America, and if he's on the board of Western Goals with the late Larry McDonald, that organization with computers to the police departments around the country, and if he works with mysterious provocateurs such as John Reese and Louise Reese on the staff, formerly she worked with Senator Joe McCarthy, where does one era end and one start over? Or is this continuous? And the answer is the era didn't end, and it is continuous, and it's building up. The article continues, millions were raised by retired General John Singlaub, president of the World Anti-Communist League. He raised $500,000 a month from wealthy United States citizens and groups since Congress cut off funds for the CIA-backed Contras. Well, this article explains that he has $500,000 a month, but why does it have to be that he raised it? If the intelligence community budget is $22 billion a year, how would you separate that money from CIA money? I asked that question when I wrote my first article on why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped. How do you separate the GOP money from the CIA money when it's all in the same bank, handled by the same hands? He raised $500,000 a month from wealthy citizens. And the point is this, when Congress again elected to cut off the money, they have the money to do what they want. At that point, the American people, as of December the 10th, 1984, should have been screaming and yelling, but there isn't a word out there. There's total silence that somebody can pick up any amount of money he wants, do anything he wants with this kind of action and those kinds of people, and there's not a word. It says what Singlaub will do, he will do with others who have sent millions of dollars, is buy uniforms and food and medicine and other aid for Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And that is fine. Uniforms, medicine, aid, and to Honduras and Guatemala. And he's also affiliated with the group, the next article that I had briefly on the air and want to continue more on, the Knights of Malta, that have sent $14 million down there. Now, the more money you send to take care of all their other needs, then they can use the money they have to buy weapons. So the weapons are doing the killing and making the orphans, as I said before. So while he buys food, medicine, and other aid to these three countries, then the countries continue to arm as they want. And if they're doing it privately, and if the Defense Department is coordinating the private aid, isn't that the policy of the United States government? Way out of control, as I said last week when they formed the CIA, the contingency to break the Constitution, take it away from the intelligence community. This is a perfect example of what happened in 1947 when the executive order went in, or beginning with William Donovan and the OSS and preceding the OSS. If the Congress says, and again, if you can't have it, and if private people are doing it, how come the Defense Department delivers it? And if they deliver it on their airplanes and with their aides, how do we know it isn't going into the Defense Department? The article says a private institute was formed by John Singlaub and called the Institute for Regional and International Studies in Boulder, Colorado, to train police force in Salvador and possible Contra soldiers if the U.S. government will not. Well, he sits in the Defense Department. The Defense delivers everything. And if the Defense Department's hands are tied in any way, then he has the Institute for Regional and International Studies to do what he wants. And then it goes on to say that Alexander M.S. McColl, and I'll be using that name a lot, M.C., small c, capital C-O-O-L, the military affairs advisor from Soldiers of Fortune, a magazine, will be the director of the Boulder Institute and give technical assistance in El Salvador. So now we bring in a new element, the Soldier of Fortune, and John Singlaub helped found that with Mr. Brown, the same Brown that was part of the Christian Defense League, with Edgar Eugene Bradley, with Colonel William Gale, training with Charles Willoughby. The Soldier of Fortune mercenaries that became the private armies that send soldiers anywhere is directly linked to the intelligence community and the Defense Department. So Singlaub goes from meetings of the World Anti-Communist League right to the Defense Department, heads up his own group called the Institute for Regional and International Studies in Boulder, Colorado, and then they're trained by a man, Mr. McCall, who works for Soldier of Fortune now and gives technical assistance in El Salvador. And these are the magazines that sell the Nazi regalia, the books on how to kill, the instructions on domestic terrorism and sabotage, and offensive weapons with silencers. And I'll do more on the Soldier of Fortune as soon as I can, but I want to lay the groundwork for the interweaving of these organizations. The article continues, this is the one on the private groups. General H.C. Aderholt, and I didn't stress his name enough on the first broadcast I did on this, said that the Defense Department hasn't helped much because of congressional opposition. Hasn't helped much. He is head of the Air Commando Association, and I'll be doing a great deal on him, of Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and he has distributed so far $4.5 million in food and medicine in El Salvador, provided by the Christian Broadcasting Network and the World Medical Relief, which will be proven to be a hand-in-glove relationship with the Central Intelligence Community. Now, Pat Roberts of the Christian Broadcasting Company was not only funded by Phyllis and Fred Schlafly, but by J. Peter Grace. The Alliance of Grace, of course, goes to the Nazis and I.G. Farben, the chemical companies, and a lot more in Germany, and the Flick organization, Frederick Flick, and various people who were prosecuted in the Nuremberg trial and released. But he helped Mr. Pat Robertson get started, and this broadcasting then, in turn, puts up funds and food, what they call food and medicine, but those products of food and medicine are mingled with military activity in South America. So Mr. Aderholt, who heads the World Medical Relief, is directly tied to the CIA and the Pentagon, but he's complaining because Congress hasn't helped much. And they have to have an organization in Colorado to train people, and they have plenty of places around the United States to train them, because the Defense Department's hands are tied. Can you imagine what this country and world would be like if their hands weren't tied, if you look at what they're doing now? I'll take a 1-minute break and then get on to more articles pertaining to the way the power group moves from private organizations into the Defense Department and intelligence community and carries on their own wars. This is Mae Brussell on a program called World Watchers. It's part 2 of that broadcast, number 694, in case you just picked it up in the middle or at some other point. And this is the date of this broadcast is March 26, 1985. I want to continue with this particular article, and then, as I say, detail these names that they're a little more clear than when I rushed through them before, because the article is titled Private Groups, and I keep wanting to stress that point. Now, if they're sending medical care and food to people who've been ravaged by war, who really need this, the innocent victims in the villages, and this isn't the history of these men, the past history at all, then the use of Mr. McCall of Military Affairs, the editor of Soldier of Fortune, giving technical assistance in El Salvador, has more to do with shooting and training Army people for activity than it does for how a course and an institute on how to distribute food and medical care. Now, John Singlaub, close to the Defense Department, has these 2 organizations, the Institute for Regional and International Studies in Colorado that I mentioned, run by Soldier of Fortune, which is in effect his offshoot or his baby, the magazine, with Mr. McCall in charge. And he's head of the U.S. Council for World Freedom. Singlaub said his U.S. Council for World Freedom has received substantial coordinating help from the Pentagon, and his group works with other groups, including Mr. Aderholt's, the Air Commando Association, retired military, who is retired from the Pentagon, and also part of the Central Intelligence Agency. So, and he says they have distributed more than $6 million to the Contra families. Now, how do you separate these organizations, and what is all the fuss of the journalists calling this private groups? The far right says that the Washington Post is so liberal that they should really be done away with. I don't think the Reverend Moon's paper does a better job. They cover this up with the title, the adjective private groups, when it isn't that at all, and with a little work they could find it out. In fact, Mr. Aderholt was complaining, the head of the Air Commando Association, General H.C. Aderholt, he was complaining about the liberals in Congress. He says the liberals in Congress try to tie his organization, the Air Commando Association, and the World Medical Relief to some sinister plan of the Central Intelligence Agency. Well, he has been directly linked to the Central Intelligence Agency, and those details I'll go into later. But if the United States does not have reason to go into these areas and shoot people up like we did in Southeast Asia, and if we don't have the inclination to continue it because it hasn't achieved anything for our country in the dictatorships that we've put in, we became the losers in Nicaragua and in Iran, and in Chile is on the brink of a revolution, and we haven't tried any other way. There's nothing in our minds as alternatives. And when the members of Congress want a balance, and certainly Congress isn't a leftist Congress by any imagination, if they don't like the Congress, and Singlaub and the World Anti-Communist League and General H.C. Aderholt out of Miami and a lot of other high generals and admirals, but these are the key ones that I'm stressing because they're national, international relationships. Again, they can do what they like on their own. And their background came from Reinhard Gehlen. Now, I was talking about Gehlen for the past 10, 11 years. I've been on the air 14 years and identified him in my first published article in 1972. The meaning of what Gehlen did to our country wasn't recognizable then. It seemed that things were going all right, and even though we put in military dictatorships, there weren't so many and people weren't adding them up, and there were no groups of human rights. seeing what was happening to the torture victims. But I think in 1985, you can begin to recognize the damage that Galen instructed or did to us when he came to this country in 1945. So Singlaub is bragging about his private work being mixed with the Defense Department and his two organizations being mixed with the Defense Department. Now, Jeremiah Denton is very much supporting, he has very much supported these groups. He talks about international terrorism, but he funds these Nazi terrorists and doesn't blush a bit about it. And he had an amendment put in through Congress in fiscal 1985, a defense bill named for Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama that authorizes the Pentagon to use ships and airplanes, space-available bases, to put the food and medicine to regions. He says no weapons or military equipment may be sent. How would we know? But the fact is that Jeremiah Denton is very much a part of this group and their operations, a member of Congress, and he knows that Congress is questioning what is happening with El Salvador and the death squads and in South America, but he supports terrorism from the right and always cries about terrorism on the left. Now, when John Singlaub met with the Defense Department in May of '84, his purpose was to study the wars in Central America and offer his advice to this part of military history. Well, what advice would he have? His Southeast Asia group brought, and he worked with the Phoenix operation, was just a part of it, his special operations group. What makes John Singlaub in 1985 an expert on how to handle various countries and the dictatorships that we put into, and what has happened to the people, and what makes him think that Central America can become anything with the kind of conflicts, the decisions we make about who should rule those people that we have done since World War II with the overthrow of Guatemala, and our interference has been continuous ever since then. Nation magazine had an article by Peter Stone, and he reported a meeting at the request of Fred Ickle, I-C-K-L-E, you know the man, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and he had John Singlaub there, plus veterans of guerrilla warfare from the Philippines and Korea and South Vietnam, and the retired generals Edward Lansdale. And I mentioned these on the air, as I say, a few weeks ago or a month ago, but I wanted to bring them up again, and General H.C. Aderholt, because Lansdale was in part of that counterinsurgency operation. And these men, John Singlaub, Edward G. Lansdale, and General H.C. Aderholt, A-N-D-E-R-H-O-L-T, had such a big part in the mass murders, the clearing of villages, the torture, the continuous harassment of villages and women and children in Vietnam, not separating them from any enemy. The cruelty of Vietnam was in their hands. And they were invited with an 8-member panel to the Defense Department and issued a classified report to move from conventional warfare, which is what has been going on in El Salvador, one shooting and the other shooting back, to apply increased emphasis on psychological warfare, which includes civic action against people in the communities and killing people who have no role in the warfare, who aren't liberals or leftists, but for general terror to make the people afraid in general. The psychological warfare requires small unit operations to break up and burn villages, coffee plantations, which they're doing, and trying to stop the means of support for the people, cutting off gasoline supplies and bringing in the necessary supplies to live. Mr. Aderholt's organization, the Air Commando Association, is 1,500 members. John Singlaub and the panel criticized the Pentagon for thinking in conventional warfare terms that will not work in El Salvador, that they want to go into Central America and do what they did there, but that didn't work. They're saying, oh, you have to let us, the experts, Aderholt and Lansdale and Singlaub, tell you what to do, with Henry Kissinger as the big advisor over them, and they're directing the Pentagon on something that they couldn't succeed in doing in Southeast Asia, and getting the money and the funds to continue the massacre in Central America. Well, that meeting, as I say, was in December in the Defense Department, just months after the World Anti-Communist League, when Singlaub became president of the organization. And shortly after that, in February, the Washington Post, not the New York Times, had the article that I briefly mentioned again too quickly, 14 million in medical aid funneled to Central America. I mentioned it briefly again. This was on broadcast number 689, February the 18th, 1985. But again, I ran out of time and didn't give enough time to that article as it builds up to some of these other stories because of the links to the Vatican. We have John Singlaub in the other story linked to the World Anti-Communist League in last week's program, linked to that, and also now his links to the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency. And then the next element that supports and contributes to these private armies that are literally making the decisions away from the hands of Congress are the members of the Knights of Malta, the Vatican. It was formed to defend the Vatican, the Roman Empire, in the year 1000, and members of the intelligence community, the Defense Department, major spies from Reinhard Gehlen, who was knighted, and James Angleton, William Buckley, James Buckley, William Casey, William Donovan. I've gone over many times the importance of the Knights of Malta, Frank Shakespeare from the U.S. Information Agency, and so forth. Decision-making people in the intelligence community associated and knighted by the Vatican, and working also with John Singlaub and the World Anti-Communist League and those people, and they are doing their contribution that they call charity. Just briefly to refresh your memory on the article and run through it quickly, this 14 million in medical aid funneled to Central America, called medical aid, and then it turns out it isn't necessarily, of course, medical aid at all. The foundation is called the AmeriCares Foundation, founded by Robert McCauley. They raised $10 million for El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala in the last 2 years. But again, it cites that it is distributed through the armed forces. This is the Vatican organization, the Knights of Malta, using the armed forces. The other is private groups helping the Contras using the armed forces. The AmeriCares is the largest of a dozen relief programs in Central America. And under Ronald Reagan, he is trying, this is a quote, to encourage private involvement in foreign and worldwide affairs, partly to bypass bureaucratic tangles with the receiving nations and to avoid the strings that Congress ties to federal programs. The reason I'm going back to this article is I didn't have time to give these quotations that I felt you should have, because, again, Singlaub is saying Congress is tying my hands. Aderholt is saying Congress is tying our hands. The President of the United States says, I want to avoid the strings that Congress ties to federal programs, the strings, so that decapitations and the torturing and the taking of property and the real cruel things that are going on, very cruel, around the world and in Central and South America, he wants you to stay out of it, to butt out of it. And I will invite these people and encourage them. The president will have his press conference and say it's perfectly natural for you to do it, invite you to the Pentagon and give you what you want. So the president encourages them, and this is called private charity, that these corporations and individuals, in this case the Vatican, can do the work. But the Vatican is closely linked to the Central Intelligence Agency, and we now have an ambassador there, Mr. Wilson, who goes back and forth from the United States to the Vatican, but it is documented over and over again, the links to the intelligence community. So the CIA can send the Vatican $1 million, and they can give it to the Knights of Malta, and it's not private at all. Again, it comes from our taxpayers' money and looks like it's from the heart of the religious Catholics. The article says 10% of the fundings for this particular operation, along with the Knights of Malta, comes from the Christian Broadcasting Network. So again, he's funding the men working with the Defense Department and the people with the Knights of Malta overlapping. And it says J. Peter Grace, this is the part where they bring in Grace is a friend of Pat Robertson. Some people mention Christian Broadcasting and not J. Peter Grace. They were roommates at Yale. And the Knights of Malta have been doing this, according to the Washington Post, for 900 years. Well, the this isn't necessarily charity. The this is representing the Roman Empire. It goes on, delivery of shipments are controlled by the Knights of Malta. They take care of that, and so the orders the Knight of Malta make sure who gets it. So I'm sure you have to be a good Christian or a good Catholic to get what humanitarian medicine is delivered. what the Washington Post goes on to say, while denying that this was a CIA operation, Mr. H.C. Aderholt met at the Defense Department in February of '85 in order to move away from conventional warfare, which I quoted to you as he wants to go in there with weapons, and he works with these people. He's asking for counterinsurgency warfare, and yet he works and admits he works with members of the Knights of Malta. So how can it be a religious humanitarian investment of $14 million plus when bypassing the people in Washington when he works with them and mingles these agencies and says that the purposes are counterinsurgency warfare and increased civic action? The word civic action means bringing in hospitals and relief, but that's also part of the counterintelligence operations. The Knights of Now, this article in the Washington Post in February of this year said, heading the Knights of Malta in El Salvador are two men, Gerald Coughlin, Coughlan, a retired FBI agent, retired, like James McCord or E. Howard Hunt, I wonder again, the executive international harvester, and Miguel Salaveria, a coffee importer who has property in El Salvador. And it's in the warehouses of Mr. Coughlin of International Harvester that they house the medical supplies. The military-industrial complex has to do with industrial people, too, and the American multinational corporations, and they use Coughlin's headquarters that is also used by the Central Intelligence Group, the pro-government CIA of El Salvador, the military dictatorship group, headed by H.C. Aderholt, the retired general of the Air Commando Associations, and that's the one I referred to in the past article, said he uses the Knights of Malta warehouse, and they also get support from the Salvadorian Air Force commander. So income, I don't want to go too fast, and I want to make this clear, income these other elements of the Central Intelligence Agency and Mr. Aderholt using the warehouse of the Knights of Malta, the International Harvester warehouse from the executive there, and keeping material also from the Salvadorian Air Commander. So how do you separate all this from the Salvadorian Army and the death squads and the dictatorship that continues the reign of terror for a handful of families down in El Salvador? Mr. Aderholt has sent to El Salvador $4.5 million, and he says it's medical relief and so forth. And again, in this article, complains about the liberals in Congress and what they're doing. J. Peter Grace, the head of W.R. Grace, chairman of the American Division of Knights of Malta, is the active member of the AmeriCares Foundation, run by Robert McCauley, as I said. The attorney Prescott Bush, Jr., whose name I mentioned a while back on the broadcast about this, the brother of the Vice President of the United States, the former CIA Director George Bush. His brother is active with William Simon, the former Secretary of the Treasury. He recently resigned from Helionetics, but that was because of scandals and the formation and profits. It's under investigation in Los Angeles for legal matters that I want to go into with you. But William Simon is active with J. Peter Grace. He's a Knight of Malta and the brother of the Vice President, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, with that much weight, Brzezinski being a national advisor on the board of AmeriCares, how can you separate the Defense Department, the CIA, from the religious organization when Grace and Bush and Simon and Brzezinski head the group and then work with people whose warehouses are shared by Mr. Aderholt with his relationships to the CIA and working with the El Salvadorian military junta? Another fellow who's active with the Knights of Malta down there, and I mentioned him before, was Robert Alejos, the head of the Knights of Malta in Honduras, who had the CIA use his coffee plantation in Nicaragua for a training group from the Central Intelligence Agency at the time of the Bay of Pigs. And the medical companies I mentioned that give the supplies, I won't repeat that again, are G.D. Searle, Sterling Drug, Merck and Company, and Richardson from Westport, Connecticut, and there are about 40 or 50 medical companies that help supply down there, but those are the four major ones. So when you have the very top people in government, like the former National Security Advisor Brzezinski and the brother of the vice president, and a man with the power of J. Peter Grace, and he represents the American group of the Knights of Malta, very influential in Germany and in Italy, in Rome, and in the United States, and a cabinet position, or like a cabinet position for Ronald Reagan, deciding where our domestic budgets go when, after the military has spent their money and the space stations and the space warfare allocations are made, then W.R. Grace and Company has J. Peter Grace to tell us how we should divide up what's left for the United States citizens to use, and he's funding these millions of dollars down there that are mingled with the dictatorships and with the cover of being humanitarian, but there isn't very much humanitarian going down in El Salvador or in Nicaragua. Now I want to bring one more element into this that I mentioned briefly before at the meeting of the World Anti-Communist League and how it was formed, and that's Reverend Moon and the Moon Organization that surfaced in 1966, setting up that international organization of countries that are anti-communist but not anti-fascist. Jack Anderson, an article February 21st, 1985, Cash Flows to the Rebels, and this tells about the anti-Sandinista guerrillas in Nicaragua are getting along just fine without Congress. If Congress cuts off the money, Reagan has the privatization of the administration for covert war, which is no longer covert. You can see the articles, I'm just citing a few of them. And when the cutoff came, the money didn't stop, and Jack Anderson said several private groups stepped up into the activity with money and supplies that included the Unification Church, Reverend Moon's church, Soldier of Fortune magazine, and the Louisiana-based Friends of the Americas Foundation. Now that's a new one for some of you, the Friends of the Americas Foundation, and I'll go into that. But if the money is cut off and it's being sent or help, the help is coming from Soldier of Fortune magazine, how do you separate that from Mr. Singlaub, General John Singlaub, when he set up Soldier of Fortune and is invited to the Pentagon and plans strategy with General Lansdale and General Aderholt? You can't separate them, you just give them different names. Or Reverend Moon sets up the World Anti-Communist League, and John Singlaub is the president of the World Communist League, and repeat again, on purpose, John Singlaub is in the Pentagon with the men who did the counterinsurgency and the Phoenix operations in Southeast Asia. So Moon comes in as another level, the highest level being Aderholt and Singlaub and Lansdale, and then below them and along with them, right side by side, is the Vatican with the Knights of Malta and our intelligence agencies from the Vatican that you can't separate, and Reverend Moon that you can't separate from Singlaub, and the Korean CIA from our CIA, and the Soldier of Fortune magazine, which is set up with the mercenaries to do the jobs. So what you have here, and I want to make it very clear on this broadcast and continue into it in the next week or the weeks to come, what you have is what I tried to explain last week and for the past few years, the takeover of the decision-making out of the legislative into the Defense Department and the intelligence agency, and this schnook of a president who's gone all the way with the Anti-Communist League and taken all the benefits and all the fringe benefits of being president, which include just laughing and smiling at every camera and waving while you go on and off every helicopter, and letting these people do just what he said he was going to do, and it's going to get worse. The point is that all of them are directly tied to the Defense Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, and there isn't any difference. Now, the mention of the Friends of the Americas Foundation is one that you might not have heard of. The humanitarian aid legislation, and this goes into the subject of that, was co-sponsored, as I mentioned before, by Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama and Representative Bob Livingston, representative from Louisiana. One of Livingston's constituents in Louisiana State Legislature, Lopius Woody, that's his nickname in quotes, Jenkins, was the founder and driving force behind the Friend of the Americans Foundation. He set it up as a refugee relief agency to aid the victims of communist aggression. The way you aid the victims of communist aggression is to put hands guns into the hands of these people and let them shoot it out, fighting and teaching them to fight. There isn't much aid going on. This group, the refugee relief people on the scene, have expressed misgivings about the new United States assistance. They are concerned that it is being used politically. How did they ever come to that conclusion? Jack Anderson writes this, I guess, with a straight face. The Agency for International Development has been in charge of a new program that started last November, and meanwhile, the private aid continues to flow to the Contras, and it comes from the Friends of the Americas contingent, which includes an assistant to Jeremiah Denton that is involved with this Americans Foundation. Now, they have sent down a lot of money. The taxpayers, all of us, have contributed $7.5 million for the purposes of other than food and immediate necessities. You know what that would be. So the money that they're calling help for humanitarian reasons, dispensed through the military, with the military, into warehouses shared by the military for all purposes, is going into the hands of the government intact in El Salvador to keep down any chance of a revolution or a change there, or to supply the Contras to make sure that they can get rid of the very people who displaced or removed Somoza because they objected to his policies and the way they had to live. John Singlaub, with a history of these various organizations, takes on another role, and now I'm going into some information that is very, very important. I'll do as much as I have time for this evening and then continue it next week, done by some other researchers that have provided me with this material. Some of the material I had, a lot I didn't have, and of course I'm appreciative for the time and work that they have put to connect these various groups that I have identified from time to time and bring in some new elements that some of you are not aware of. And some of this I'm quoting from a report that they put together, and other sections I'll paraphrase and pass on to you. What they are saying, these particular researchers, is that outside of the major media, and we know that, and outside of national and international law, there are organized and heavily armed paramilitary networks that are growing in the United States. They became aware that what was fascism, South and Central America, Europe, Southeast Asia, was growing in the United States, and I have saved 6 filing cabinets with 24 drawers of people that I believe have been victims of death squads that I've been aware of, are being wiped out for a lot of particular reasons, and the power to continue this and escalate it is getting even more scary at the present time. They said there are connections of these groups to both retired and active ranking military and intelligence officers, as I point out in those articles, just current ones in the newspaper, the Washington Post. And they use recruits from Vietnam and the Korean War veterans. They can say, we lost that war, but we'll avenge the Bay of Pigs. The Korean War and the Vietnam War were not successful for the United States, and yet we use the same people, whether it's Alexander Haig or Henry Kissinger and Mr. Lansdale and the whole cast of characters that run through this era. The strength of fascism was losing World War I and learning how to rearm and almost take the world, as Adolf Hitler did, by the fact that the Germans were embarrassed and angry at the settlements of World War I and were determined again to get ready for another war. I wonder if we did not win these wars, because then we would have a motivation for these particular people who constantly bring up the fact of the wars we lost, and therefore have taken the Constitution and literally torn it to shreds, and are now working behind the biblical prophecies for another war, and using the veterans for these various organizations that come from the past 3 wars, that didn't learn anything from the past 3 wars, but are gung-ho to get into the next one. They also have recruited from their organizations, according to this particular study I'm citing, members of the Waffen-SS and the Waffen-SS worshippers. Some are trained by Hitler's Waffen-SS for global operations. They're violently racist. They're sadistic. They refer to them as neo-Nazis, new young Nazis, and of course I say they include, and they know, the Waffen-SS, of course, is the old Nazis. And they're compared identical to the FREIKORPS, the paramilitary group that appeared in Germany after World War I, secretly preparing war against Russia, to control the world eventually, to have a 1,000-year Reich under the protection of General Ludendorff and others. I'm running out of time now. I'm going to continue with the lines of these particular people who are working and growing in the United States now, and the way they have centered their power since World War II. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, California. The program is World Watchers, and I'll be back with you next week.